There is no consensus on how Europe became uniquely wealthy by the mid-19th century. However, Eric Jones's European miracle probably comes closest to enunciating the current mainstream posy.
Tie-in.
Jones's argument is eclectic, and many Europeanists would reject or question many of his claims, but several of his general propositions nonetheless command wide assent. For our purposes, the most important of these general statements, one also found in any number of other works, is that industrialization was not the point at which European economic history departed from other Old World trajectories. Instead, it represents the full flower of differences that had been more subtly building for centuries. In fact, many scholars simply take this for granted, since Jones explicitly argues for the proposition. His work serves as a useful point of departure. According to Jones, Europeans were already uniquely wealthy before industrialization. In particular, they had vastly more capital at their disposal, especially livestock, which they accumulated by holding back population growth a little below its maximum. This in turn allowed Europeans to hold their consumption levels a little above those of Asia. Moreover, their capital stock was less liable to destruction because Europe suffered fewer natural disasters and began sooner than other places to build with fire-resistant brick and stone. Thus, less of Europe's annual surplus above subsistence was needed to offset depreciation, and its advantage in capital stock grew steadily with time, even before the Industrial Revolution. But in fact, there is little evidence to suggest a quantitative advantage in Western Europe's capital stock before 1800 or a set of durable circumstances, demographic or otherwise, that gave Europe a significant edge in capital accumulation. Nor is it likely that Europeans were significantly healthier, i.e., advantaged in human capital, more productive, or otherwise heirs of many years of slowly accruing advantages over the more developed parts of Asia. When we turn to comparisons of the technology embodied in the capital stock, we do find some important European advantages emerging during the 2 or 3 centuries before the Industrial Revolution, but we also still find areas of European backwardness. Europe's disadvantages were concentrated in areas of agriculture, land management, and the inefficient use of certain land-intensive products, especially fuel wood. As it worked out, some of the areas in which Europe had an edge turned out to be important for truly revolutionary developments, while the particular areas in which other societies had better techniques did not. But even Europe's technological leadership in various sectors would not have allowed a breakthrough to self-sustaining growth without other changes that made it much freer than other societies of its land base. This was partially a result of catching up in some of the land-saving technologies in which it lagged, a process that was greatly facilitated by knowledge gained through overseas empire and partly a matter of serendipity, which located crucial resources, especially forest-saving coal, in particularly fortunate places. It was also partly due to global conjunctures. Those global conjunctures, in turn, were shaped by a combination of European efforts, many of them violent, epidemiological luck, and some essentially independent developments. One example of the latter is China's switch to a silver-based economy, which helped keep New World mines profitable and sustain Europe's colonial presence during the long period before other products were developed. These global conjunctures allowed Western Europeans access to vast amounts of additional land-intensive resources. Moreover, they could obtain these resources without needing to further strain a European ecology that was already hard-pressed before the great 19th century boom in population and per capita resource use, and without having to reallocate vast amounts of their own labor to the various labor-intensive activities that would have been necessary to manage their own land for higher yield and greater ecological sustainability. Without these external factors, Europe's inventions alone might have been not much more revolutionary in their impact on economy and society than the marginal technological improvements that continued to occur. In 18th century China, India, and elsewhere, agriculture, transport, and livestock capital. Europe did indeed have more livestock per person than most other settled societies, and within a European system of farming that livestock constituted such valuable capital equipment that more farm animals usually meant more prosperity. And in a few places in Asia, a shortage of livestock did interfere with cultivating more land. In parts of 18th century Bengal, for instance, landless laborers were unable to take advantage of empty, fertile land because they lacked access to plow animals, but this was less because of an absolute shortage of livestock than because landlords, fearing the loss of their labor force, took care to monopolize the necessary animals. The very fact that unused land was still plentiful makes it unlikely that Malthusian pressures were to blame for people not having livestock. In some other Asian societies, human populations had reached densities at which they restricted the availability of livestock, but nothing in those cases indicates that a shortage of farm animals inhibited agricultural production. Indeed, had a shortage of animals been a crucial problem, it is hard to see why at least larger, wealthier farmers would not have raised and used more of them. Yet for the period in which we have reasonable data, there is no observable difference between large and small North China farms in animal power used.
Per acre.
Moreover, what by European standards was a tiny number of animals sufficed to do all the work needed to keep virtually all usable land under cultivation. Moreover, in this region with a crop mix and ecology more like Europe's than that of the rice-growing South, my best estimate is that even with relatively few draft animals, late 18th century Chinese placed considerably more and higher quality manure on the soil than did their European contemporaries. The resulting yields supported an exceptionally dense population for a dry farming region at living standards that, as we shall soon see, were probably comparable to that of Western Europe. Meanwhile, in the rice regions of Asia, even smaller numbers of draft animals coincided with the highest agricultural yields in the world. Rice farming simply does not require as much animal power, and post-harvest operations also require much less power than does making wheat flour. Subtropical and tropical regions elsewhere, such as Mesoamerica, also supported dense populations with few or even no plow animals. If even with more animals European farming was not exceptionally productive, it is hard to see this as a crucial advantage. Of course, plow animals can also pull other loads. The huge preponderance of land transport in pre-industrial Europe probably results in part from the availability of so many farm animals who had to be fed every day but were only needed part-time for farming. Did Europe then have a crucial advantage in capital equipment for land transportation? Perhaps so, compared to East Asia, where pasture land was so scarce, but the remarkable development of water transport in China and Japan surely offset this and represented an at least equally valuable form of capital in transport. East Asia's overall advantage in transport was noted at the time by Adam Smith. 1 degree, and in parts of Asia, where, as in Europe, there was lots of meadow and grassland, rural transport was probably just as highly developed. The enormous bullock trains of North India, sometimes including 10,000 beasts, are a powerful if anecdotal example. Quantitative estimates are fraught with many uncertainties, but what we can piece together suggests that the animal-borne freight hauling capacity of 18th century North India was not wildly different on a per-person basis from Werner Sombart's estimate for Germany in 1800.12, and both China and India had long purchased warhorses and some other livestock from Central Asia, which had enormous amounts of pasture. After 1700, the Qing dynasty controlled much of this territory and bred its own warhorses. Had the Chinese needed to import other animals, this would have been ecologically feasible. 2.13 Nor do we see other signs of a shortage of transport capital in Asia.
Such a
shortage would presumably inhibit marketing, particularly of bulky goods,
such as grain.
Yet in one of the most crowded societies of all China, The share of the harvest that was marketed over long distances seems to have been considerably higher than that in Europe. Wu Chengming has conservatively estimated that 30 million share of grain entered long-distance trade in the 18th century, or enough to feed about 14 million people. This would be more than 5 times a generous estimate of Europe's long-distance grain trade at its pre-1800 peak and over 20 times the size of the Baltic grain trade in a normal year during its heyday. 7. Furthermore, Wu's figure includes only the largest of many grain trading routes in China and uses cautious estimates even for those. He omits, for instance, Shandong province, which had a population of about 23 million, slightly larger than that of France, and was neither particularly commercialized nor particularly backward. It imported enough grain in an average 18th century year to feed 700,000 to 1 million people more than the Baltic trade fed, and exported roughly the same amount. Thus, if we treat the grain entering and exiting this nation-sized piece of China as the equivalent of international trade in Europe, we find that this one province engaged in a grain trade comparable to all of Europe's long-distance grain trading, and there must have been quite a bit of grain trading within the province as well, since even this volume of imports could not have met the demand from its urban areas, not to mention its cotton and tobacco growers. Nor was China unique. Many cities in various parts of Asia, and probably one or two in pre-colonial America, were larger than any European city before 18th century London, and several were larger than London as well. It has been estimated that 22% of Japan's 18th century population lived in cities, versus 10 to 15% for Western Europe, 20, and the Malay archipelago, though sparsely populated overall, may have been 15% urban. 21. Many of these cities, as well as some in South Asia and the Middle East, were heavily dependent on long-distance shipments of bulky foods. Overall, then, it seems very hard to find evidence of a European advantage in transportation. A last possibility would be that European animals provided a crucial difference by providing power for industrial activities such as turning millstones. But the rice-eating parts of Asia needed less milling to begin with, since rice, unlike wheat, was often eaten without being turned into flour. When rice was to be pounded into flour, this was generally done in very small quantities at a time, but not for lack of animal power. Rather, it was the nature of rice itself, which spoils very rapidly once unhusked, which called for hand processing small daily amounts. 2. Moreover, most mills and other industrial facilities, whether in Europe or Asia, were small. They also took many days off due to limited demand, customary restraints such as holidays and other short ages, e.g., of fuel for forges. Thus, large numbers of animals were not generally needed, and there is nothing to suggest that a shortage of animal power was a significant brake on industrial development anywhere. So, if Europe's animals made a difference, it would not have been as a capital good, but only as an item of consumption, i.e., as a source of protein for which other areas had no adequate substitute. Europeans certainly ate more meat and far more dairy products than most peoples in Asia, but this advantage was declining, not growing, in the early modern period, and doing so rapidly. Meat consumption in Germany, for instance, fell by about 80% between the late Middle Ages and 1800. 23. Furthermore, meat was not an irreplaceable source of protein. Many Mesoamericans and North Americans seem to have gotten the most important amino acids in meat from corn, beans, and squash, and East Asians from bean curd. More generally, any argument based on one aspect of diet or one other feature, such as having more brick and stone buildings, is shaky. How are we to decide which differences constitute being ahead in standard of living? 24. Why emphasize Europe's probable edge in housing rather than, say, the remarkable supply of safe drinking water in much of Japan, China, and Southeast Asia? 25. Or the greater comfort and durability of cotton, which was available able to even the poor through most of Asia, and preferred by even the rich in Europe once it became available? The only definitive answer would be that Europeans' particular mix of material goods made them healthier, longer lived, or more energetic, and our admittedly limited evidence indicates no such thing. Paul Barrack, projecting backward from 20th century data, has generated estimates of per capita income for most of the world circa 1800. In his figures, Asia as a whole is very slightly behind Western Europe but ahead of Europe as a whole, and China remains ahead of even Western EU. Rope point 26, but Barrack's exercise is also fraught with many difficulties. Rather than rely on the single number he generates for each economy, I will build my own case for the economic ordinariness of 18th century Europe, proceeding topic by topic. Living longer? Living better? Life expectancy at birth in England, perhaps the most prosperous part of EU. Rope was about 32 in 1650 even for the children of peers. It passed 40 only after 1750.27. John Nodal finds life expectancy for the people of 14 West German villages to have fluctuated between 35 and 40 throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, a figure which, as we shall see, is higher than 19th century aggregates for larger German popula. Tynes point 28. The massive study by Wrigley and Schofield of English villages gives life expectancies in the mid to high 30s throughout the 18th century, climbing to 40 in the 19th century and not going much above that level until after 1871.29. Although these figures suggest that England as a whole had, rather surprisingly, a life expectancy only slightly worse than that cited by Stone for the sons of peers, we should not leap to that conclusion. Other scholars suggest that Wrigley and Schofield have not fully corrected for the underreporting of births and deaths among the common folk before 1780. This would increase the distance between commoners and the better documented peers by decreasing the calculated life expectancies of ordinary folk. Peter Razel estimates that true English infant mortality between 1600 and 1749 may well have been anywhere from 60% to 100% higher than Wrigley and Schofield's numbers indicate. 30. This alone would depress the life expectancy at birth of 37 to somewhere between 31.6 and 34.0, and Razel suggests that other age-specific mortalities should also be adjusted upward, especially for the earlier part of this period. Life expectancy for France's much larger population was significantly lower, between 27.5 and 30 at birth for both sexes between 1770 and 1790.32 figures for slightly later, 1816 to 60, in various parts of Germany, are roughly comparable to those for France, 24.7 in East and West Prussia, 29.8 in the Rhine province, and 31.3 in Westphalia. 3. Various groups of Asians seem to have lived at least as long as these Western Europeans. Hanley and Yamamura estimate mean life expectancies at birth in 2 Japanese villages of 34.9 and 41.1 for males and 44.9 and 55.0 for females. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Smith, Ung, and Lundy calculate the total life expectancies of those who made it to age 1 in a well-documented 18th century village as 47.1 for males and 51.8 for females. 35. Thus it appears that rural Japanese, a group that does not include aristocrats who were legally required to live in castle towns, lived at least as long as Europeans, and probably longer. Chinese longevity is less impressive, but still quite comparable to European longevity. The case can be made for other Asian populations as well. Telford's study of genealogies from a relatively prosperous area suggests a mid-18th century life expectancy of 39.6 at birth, though with a decline to 34.9, still comparable to estimates for England. By the early 19th century. 36. Lee and Campbell, working with unusually good data for a village in rural Manchuria in the years 1792 to 1867, arrive at an expectancy of 35.74. 1-year-old males and 29 for 1-year-old females. These figures are a bit lower than Telford's numbers for the mid-18th century, though for females they may be depressed by what seems to have been an unusually strong preference for sons in this population. At any rate, they are still comparable to those for prosperous parts of rural Europe. Lavely and Wang find many reasons to doubt any late 18th century decline in life expectancy. They also assemble measures of Chinese life expectancy from various studies and find them to be generally greater than those for comparable groups of Northwest Europeans until the 19th century. 38 recent studies of the Qing imperial lineage, perhaps the best documented large pre-modern population anywhere and not a universally well-to-do one, present a mixed picture, but one that generally supports the idea that Chinese 39 lived as long as Western Europeans. Life expectancies at birth seem low, in part because of very high rates of infanticide. Perhaps as many as 25% of female newborns were killed, with the rate peaking in the 18th century. 4 degree. Infanticide was widely used as a family planning device, and the unusually good records for this population make it possible to see just how widespread it was. However, life expectancies for those who made it to age 1 were at or slightly above 40 by the late 18th century, for L, which makes them quite comparable with the best off among the Western European populations discussed above. That Chinese life expectancies were comparable to European ones can also be inferred from other demographic data.
As we
shall soon see, China's birth rates appear to have been lower than European ones, while its population growth rate was first higher, 1550 to 1750, and then comparable. Both China and Europe roughly doubled 1750 to 1850. This is only possible if Chinese death rates were also lower than European ones. Europe had more emigration, but not enough to make an important difference until the end of this period. Granted, further research may suggest higher birth and death rates for China than those found so far, especially if we find good data for poorer parts of the country, but our European data are also drawn disproportionately from relatively prosperous areas. The rough comparability of life expectancies in better-off parts of 18th century China and Europe, with perhaps a slight advantage for China, are also mirrored by our scattered data on nutrition. We should not assume too close a correspondence between mortality rates and nutrition, a practice that assumes pre-industrial populations had few ways of consciously influencing death rates, leaving fluctuations in available resources and exogenous crises, such as plague or war, as the main influence. Li and Wang, for instance, have made a good case that new public health measures, e.g., the spread of smallpox, invariolation, long-standing patterns of personal sanitation, using soap, boil, water, and changes in popular attitudes about everything from seeking medical care to killing or neglecting certain infants, may have had more impact on 18th century Chinese life expectancies than we would expect from research on pre-modern European populations. But even so, the basic Malthusian insight that per capita food supplies affect death rates cannot be ignored. It is thus reassuring to find that Chinese, who lived relatively long lives, seem to have had relatively abundant food. Braudel finds a huge variety in European reports of calorie intake before 1800 and notes that most come from sources on the lives of the privileged. He suggests 3,500 calories per day for people doing hard physical labor, e.g., crews in the Spanish fleet, and around 2,000 calories per head for the great urban masses. 42 19th century English data assembled by Clark, Huber, Mann, and Lindert run 2,000 to 2,500 calories per adult male equivalent for various groups of non-farm laborers households, and almost 3,300 for rural farm laborers in the 1860s. 43 Ming-Ti Pan, working backward from the rations reported for farm laborers in a 17th century agricultural manual from the Yangtze Delta, notes that these rations would have worked out to 4,600 calories from grain alone. 44 estimates of grain consumption for the entire Chinese population in the 18th century vary, but they average about 2.2 share of rice equivalent per day, yielding roughly 1,837 calories per person per day. If the age structure of the population was the same in the 18th century as it was in John Buck samples from the 1920s and 1930s, for this would convert to 2,386 calories per adult equivalent, plus whatever non-grain consumption they had. Conversion to adult male equivalents, though desirable for comparability with England, is complicated by the fact that the differences between adult male and female consumption in both 17th and 20th century rural Chinese data are considerably larger than in English samples, but if we use the late 19th century English ratio, then our Chinese figure becomes 2,651 calories per adult male. This compares well with all but one of the various British samples, including those from the much more prosperous late 19th century and quite far above Broadle's estimate for the great urban masses of Europe as a whole. 47. Data for Southeast Asia are extremely spotty, but a parish register from early 19th century Luzon suggests a life expectancy at birth of 42.8. Other scattered evidence suggests that between 1500 and 1800, elite Southeast Asians may have lived a bit longer than their European peers, and European visitors in this period often remarked on how healthy the indigenous population was. 4 For many other areas, we simply lack data. Only in India are the calculated life expectancies that we have markedly inferior to most of those for Northwest Europe, probably somewhere between 20 and 25 at birth circa 1800, based on shaky data from one. As we shall see repeatedly, a combination of enormous variety and weak data make it particularly hard to generalize about South Asia or even to make the sorts of statements about subregions that are possible for China, Japan, and Europe. In this case, it is particularly noteworthy that India had a much greater variety of labor regimes than the even larger but politically more unified Chinese Empire. The range of variation seems at least as broad as it was across Europe and thus much greater than it was in Western Europe alone. It would not be surprising if this led to equally large differences in income history, battalion and living conditions, even among areas with similar natural endowments. This was, of course, the case in Europe, too, while in China the relationship between regional ecologies and standards of living seems to have been more direct. Meanwhile, even a life expectancy of 25 is only slightly below Blaeu's figure for France. Moreover, a recent study suggests that the food purchasing power of at least South Indian laborers, both agricultural and artisanal, in the mid-18th century generally exceeded that of the English working class. S1. Birth rates. If European death rates were not exceptionally low, neither were their birth rates, and thus European families had no special advantage in preserving their patrimonies. When John Hagenel first outlined the ways in which the European fertility regime, with its high rates of celibacy, of adolescents and young adults spending years away from home as servants before they could marry, and relatively late marriages, would produce birth rates lower than those in a pre-industrial demographic regime, in which nothing was done within marriage to prevent procreation, it was widely assumed that most, if not all, of the rest of the world was characterized by such a pre-modern system. 52. There were, indeed, few large societies outside Europe that had comparable institutions to delay marriages or depress the rate of people ever married, and comparativists looking outward from Europe were simply not prepared to find effective fertility control within marriage before the time it began to appear in Europe, roughly the end of the 18th century. But it is now clear that Asians, or at least East Asians, did have some control over marital fertility. Data from Japan were the first to show surprisingly low birth rates. Much of this seems to have been an indirect and perhaps inadvertent result of customary arrangements in which young women were employed away from their home villages, often for years at a time, thus producing effects on fertility similar, though more pronounced, to those observed by Hagenel for Europe. 53. Moreover, We also have unmistakable evidence of more direct human efforts to control the number and sex of children a family had, including abortion and infanticide and perhaps contraception and abstinence as well. Still more revealing, it has become increasingly clear that these direct methods, including infanticide, were not only used as survival strategies in times of economic hardship, but as part of accumulation and mobility strategies in good times as
well.
Indeed, there is evidence that Japanese infanticide was actually more common among the well-to-do than among the poor. 5. Evidence from Southeast Asia is sparser and less compelling, but also strongly suggests that couples made various sorts of efforts to control fertile IDY, particularly the many families in which women engaged in migratory
trade.
Most recently, it has become clear that Chinese families of various classes, and in both good and bad times, employed a variety of strategies to limit their family size, space their children, and select their genders.
The
most widely used strategies appear to have been delaying pregnancy and marriage, and then preventing pregnancy after establishing a family. Recent research suggests that this made the reproductive careers of Chinese women significantly shorter on average than their European peers, despite virtually universal early marriage. The result was birth rates per marriage and per woman that were well below those of Western Europe throughout the 1550 to 1850 period. 59. In sum, it appears that various groups of Asians were at least as able and determined as any Europeans to keep birth rates down for the sake of maintaining or improving their standards of living. Moreover, the evidence of Chinese and Japanese birth rates lower than European ones supports the evidence for lower death rates and thus a fairly high standard of living, and vice versa. And if East Asians were as well or better off than Europeans, there is no prima facie reason to think they engaged in less household-level accumulation of capital. The next section considers arguments that various macro-level factors made Europeans' efforts more effective. Nonetheless, there seems then little reason to think that most Europeans, even Northwest Europeans, were uniquely well off, even as late as 1750. It thus seems unlikely that their capital stock was more valuable, since it does not seem to have enabled them to produce a better standard of living for themselves. Yet another possibility suggested by Jones that Europe's capital stock suffered less depreciation deserves separate attention.
There are possible scenarios in which
a more durable capital stock was for a long time offset by other differences, e.g., a lower rate of gross investment or lack of skilled labor, but gradually made itself felt later when those other differences became less important.
At
present, though, there seems little reason to place much weight on any such scenario. Europe's buildings may well have weathered disasters better than those in China and Japan, both of whom use less brick and stone. However, we lack adequate data to say that Europe led all other societies in this respect, or that no other compensating differences in the vulnerability of capital stock existed. Jones also argues that Europe's most common disasters, principally epidemics, wars, and harvest failures, mostly destroyed labor, rather than capital, while earthquakes and floods, which were more common in many parts of Asia than they were in Europe, were more likely to destroy capital. But again, there are reasons to doubt that this gave Europe any significant advantage. True, populations usually recovered from all but the worst disasters within a generation or two, while some destruction of capital stock had longer-lasting effects. The centuries-long decline of parts of Iran and Iraq after 13th century warfare destroyed the irrigation system, may be the most famous example. But if the basic fabric of a society was not destroyed, even elaborate kinds of infrastructure could often be rebuilt in little more time than it took for populations to recover from epidemics. For instance, the water control systems throughout China's Yangtze Valley were rebuilt fairly quickly once stable. ITY returned after years of warfare, plague, depression, and depopulation in the 17th century A and D within just a few years after comparable absolute though not proportional, levels of destruction in the mid-19th century, 63. And floods and earthquakes are presumably no more likely to destroy a society's basic fabric than is plague or drought. Thus, unless basic social order suffered more from warfare in Asia than it did in Europe, a hard case to make. Given the frequency of war in early modern Europe, its much lower incidence in at least China and Japan, and the limited extent of physical destruction in most Southeast Asian wars, 64, the argument that Europe benefited from lesser depreciation of its capital becomes very shaky. In a later work, Jones shifts his emphasis from differences in actual physical destruction to a claim that the legacy of the Mongol era saddled Asia with particularly conservative regimes, a claim we will deal with later. 5. And finally, Jones gives us no reason to think that it was necessarily more burdensome to replace ruined physical capital than to replace the human capital that Europe seems to have lost at least as rapidly as China, Japan, and perhaps Southeast Asia. Nor is there any sign that Europe's weavers, farmers, or other workers were significantly more productive than their peers in various parts of Eurasia as they should have been if they had either more or better capital. We have already seen that they do not appear to have lived longer or better, a point not only significant in itself but because it suggests that in competition between European and Asian goods, European manufacturers were not disadvantaged by paying higher real wages. So had their workers been more productive, they should have been able to sell their products in Asian markets. But as all accounts agree, European merchants had far more difficulty selling their goods in Asia than in finding markets at home for Asian goods, both for elite and mass consumption. It is possible that despite eating just as well, Asians had less of other goods than did Europeans, but we shall see in Chapter 3 that the Chinese and Japanese probably did as well. True, the largest single source of Asian manufactured exports to Europe, the Indian subcontinent, was also one large Asian region for which many scholars believe that workers' living standards were unusually low, as much because of very unequal income distribution, but Taiwan as because of actual levels of per capita production, as we shall see in Chapter 3. But Chinese textiles and other goods also found a significant Euro-American market, and not only among the rich, throughout the 18th and much of the 19th centuries. 6. What about technology? By 1850, at least Northwest Europe already had a marked technological advantage over the rest of the Old World, and this cannot be entirely a 19th century creation. But as the previous sections make clear, it seems unlikely that 18th century Europeans were, on the whole, more productive than, say, Chinese or Japanese, and that means we need to carefully circumscribe claims of overall European technological superiority circa 1750 and target our explanations accordingly. The results admit the importance of cultural and institutional factors that help spread a scientific culture but leave open, pending further research, how unique this culture was. They also tend to minimize the role of more specifically politico-economic factors, from patent law near constant remaking to the high cost of British labor, highlighted by many other scholars. Meanwhile, such results increase the prominence of knowledge gained overseas for certain crucial technologies and of a set of permissive factors related to geography and resource availability. If Europeans were, as I have argued, not ahead in overall productivity in 1750, then it is unlikely that the average level of technology they deployed was superior, but it is more plausible that the best available technologies deployed anywhere in Europe, mostly in Britain, the United Provinces, and parts of France, for various important sectors, were already the world's best. The spread of those technologies over the next century would have then narrowed the gap between Europe's best and average technologies and created much of the productivity advantage we see by 1850. Clearly, for instance, Newtonian mechanics allowed Europeans in 1750 to devise some pumps and canal locks better than any in existence elsewhere, but the ubiquity of, say, Chinese canals probably gave them a continued edge in the average degree to which they had exploited the possibilities of inland waterways until somewhat later.
And
Even if one insists on the alternate position that all of Europe's advantage in 1850 sprang from post-1750 inventions, one would want to ask what basis existed for this sudden burst of inventiveness. Much of the credit for both the accelerated diffusion of best practices after 1750 and the burst of new innovations must go to elements of the scientific culture that Margaret Jacob and others have seen emerging, especially in England in the 150 years before 1750, increased literacy and printing, the spread of scientific societies, relatively accessible public lectures, and so on. Behind these phenomena stood a strong sense that the investigation of a mechanical nature was to be encouraged because it offered both material benefits to the individual and a socially stabilizing alternative to two other epistemologies, with political implications, dogmatic priestcraft and/or popular assertiveness based on intuitive, revealed, or magical knowledge of a living nature,
God and social order.
Some parts of this configuration were indeed unique to Northwest Europe, but not all of them were. It is worth noting, for instance, that Chinese interest in the physical sciences and mathematics increased markedly in the 17th century, especially after the Manchu conquest in 1644-68, and that publishers found that medical books were a particularly good way to sell lots of books, fulfill a commitment to improve the world through their work, and steer clear of the post-conquest minefields of political controversy.
69.
More generally, the European configuration, however fruitful it proved, did not represent the only path to technological progress. Other areas still led or stayed even in various technologies and continued their own patterns of both invention and diffusion. In many areas, various non-European societies remained ahead. Irrigation, which we have already mentioned, was perhaps the most obvious, and in many other agricultural technologies, too, Europe lagged behind China, India, Japan, and parts of Southeast Asia. A Welsh Agricultural Improvement Society, founded in 1753, took this as a truism, dedicating itself to bringing closer the day in which Wales might be as flourishing as China. Degree indeed, once we have seen that life expectancies were similar, making it unlikely that Europeans were vastly better nourished. The huge differences in population densities between Europe and East Asia stand as impressive testimony to the size of that difference. To this we might add the ability of Chinese and Japanese agriculture to also keep up, as European agriculture stopped doing after 1800, with soaring demand for textile fibers and evidence to be discussed in Chapter 5, that even relatively backward North China was doing better at conserving the fertility of its soil better than, say, England or France. As we shall see later, Europeans groping for ways to combat deforestation and soil degradation in their tropical colonies near the end of the 18th century found much to learn in both India and China, but they did not apply the lessons at home in any systematic way until well into the 19th century. Take away the enormous amounts of extra land that Europe gained across the Atlantic through luck, smallpox, and violence, as well as navigational and commercial skills, and it is easy to imagine Europe's marked technological backwardness in the largest sector of 18th century economies having a significance as great as whatever advantages it had in other sectors. There were also other sectors in which late 18th century Europeans still had catching up to do. In many areas of textile weaving and dyeing, Western Europeans were still working on imitating Indian and Chinese processes. The same was true of manufacturing porcelain. As late as 1827 and 1842, too, separate British observers claimed that Indian bar iron was as good or better than English iron, and the price quoted for 1829 was less than half that of English iron in England. Various parts of Africa also produced large amounts of iron and steel that were of a quality at least as good as anything available in early modern Europe, though shortages of wood for fuel limited production. to certain areas and could make iron quite expensive in areas distant from the forests. Medicine was probably not terribly effective anywhere in the world, but East and probably Southeast Asian cities were far ahead in crucial matters of public health, such as sanitation and the provision of clean water. One of the few important medical advances of the 17th and 18th centuries, smallpox prevention seems to have been developed independently. In Europe, China, and India, recent studies have suggested that at least in the area of maternal and infant health, Qing medicine, popular knowledge of which seems to have been spreading rapidly, remains superior to its European counterpart, despite making, as far as we know, no basic conceptual breakthroughs comparable to Harvey's work on circulation. The list could go on much further. Overall, then, arguments that Europe in 1750 already enjoyed a unique level of technological sophistication need significant qualification. Even in the generation and use of energy, probably Europe's most important advantage in the 19th century, as I will argue later, the situation was much less clear. 100 years earlier, Smil estimates that energy use per capita was probably comparable in China and Western Europe circa 1700. And though the efficiency of individual power-generating machines, from water wheels to soon steam engines, was probably one of Europe's greatest areas of advantage, China had an equally marked advantage in the efficiency of its stoves, both for cooking and heating. 78. In retrospect, it is clear that given Europe's 19th century switch to available and abundant fossil fuels, European advances in finding ways to use heat had a greater revolutionary potential than China's edge in capturing heat efficiently, but only in retrospect, and only with the advantage of favorably located coal. Had fuel shortages slowed Europe's industrial growth and a breakthrough occurred elsewhere first, the wastefulness of European hearths might not appear as a minor exception to a story of growing technical superiority, but as a prime example of technological weakness that had held this area back. Or had the New World not provided enormous amounts of textile fibers, European precocity in mechanizing spinning and weaving might seem more like interesting curiosities than the centerpiece of a great transformation, and we might be invoking the low level of per acre agricultural yields in EU. Rope is a sign of serious technological weaknesses that necessitated keeping most land in food crops, and thus had caused these clever, but nonetheless insufficient inventions to languish until they were imitated elsewhere. We will return to the crucial examples of steam and spinning and their relationship to resource windfalls near the end of this chapter. The point to emphasize for now is that non-European societies retained significant technological advantages in many areas even in the late 18th century, and it was not inevitable that they would turn out to seem relatively unimportant in the long run. Nor, even once European technology began to advance faster and on a broader front, was it inevitable that this would overcome remaining weaknesses in land management, conservation, and market extension, or do so soon enough so that development would not be directed, with lasting effects, along paths requiring precisely the sorts of labor-intensive solutions found in East Asia and a few atypical parts of Western Europe, such as Denmark. Nor should we assume that these areas of non-European advantage were merely the lingering effects of once great, but now stagnant, traditions.
While
18th century Asia produced none of what Joel Mocher calls macro inventions, radical new ideas that suddenly alter production possibilities all by themselves. Europe produced few of these during the period from 1500 to 1750, and even during the years usually defined as the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1830. Meanwhile, smaller technical improvements of various sorts continue to be made in many different geographic and technological areas. European dyes that briefly enjoyed a strong vogue in China were then imitated by native innovators, just as happened with many Asian products in Europe. In the 17th century, somebody discovered that a certain kind of cellar would trap enough humidity to allow cotton spinning during the many dry months in cotton-growing North China. This innovation spread like wildfire over the next 100+ years, allowing a region with a population far exceeding that of any European country to produce its own textiles and greatly reduce seasonal unemployment, just as it is only the rise of fossil fuels which made getting the most out of every ounce of combustible material much less important than before, that made the efficiency of Chinese stoves a footnote rather than a crucial fact. It is only because we know that within another century home-based textile production of any sort would come to seem backward that these sellers do not appear as a simple but vital technical breakthrough disseminated at an impressive rate. 81 The example of spinning sellers is also revealing because though we know extremely little about how this innovation was disseminated, we know it was. Though the design was simple, the people who needed to learn about it were among the poorest, most dispersed, and least literate members of society. This sort of diffusion could occur fairly rapidly over a large area, with the mechanism being invisible to us should make us cautious about asserting that in the absence of scientific societies and Newtonian clergymen, China and other societies lacked adequate means for spreading new and useful knowledge. At this point, we know relatively little even about scientific discussions among the elite, and as Benjamin Ellman and others have shown, these discussions were far livelier in the 18th century than we have generally supposed. 82. Granted, the discussion proceeded mostly in classical Chinese and largely by the exchange of letters rather than in more institutionalized settings, but these letters were not really private documents, and the discussions in them were wide-ranging, sophisticated, and often quite practical. Without organized scientific societies, the popularization of complex findings was likely to be slower than it was in England or Holland, and might well have made cross-pollination between elite science and artisanal knowledge more difficult. But much remains to be learned about the possible contribution of vernacular publications in science and technology, especially now that we have become aware of a lively trade in vernacular medical texts, admittedly a more prestigious subject than other kinds of science or technology. Moreover, unlike in Europe, where these formal scientific societies were often essential to protecting science from a hostile established church, in China there was no such powerful and hostile body, and it is not clear why the particular kinds of institutions that developed in Europe should have been the sine qua non of scientific or technological progress everywhere. So rather than search for reasons why Chinese science and technology stagnated in general, which they did not do, we need to look at why the paths on which they continued to progress did not revolutionize the Chinese economy. By the same token, while giving full credit to the institutions that helped European science and technology advance unusually rapidly and on a broad front, we also need to think about which particular paths of development proved economically critical and look for factors that allowed them to be so. To borrow Joel Mocher's metaphor, though with a different aim, we must compare not only the motors of technological change but also the steering wheels and the terrains over which different societies steered. Not only did Western Europe not lead in all areas of technology, but of the areas in which they did lead, only some had long-term importance. For instance, Western Europeans had the world's most efficient water wheels by this time, 83, but this alone did not give the European industries that used water power a competitive edge capable of overcoming high transport costs, or high costs in other aspects of production, and conquering markets elsewhere. And, at any rate, this was an advantage that could be deployed at only a limited number of sites and could not be expanded indefinitely even at those sites. The same was true of many, many other technologies. Whether created in Europe later in this chapter, I will argue that the most important innovations for creating sustained growth were land-saving ones in one way or another, particularly those associated with fossil fuels, which reduced reliance on forests for energy. But it has been far more common to argue that the crucial phenomenon was the rise of a labor-saving emphasis in European technological innovation. The common argument is that economic differences, principally the fact that Western European laborers were free and allegedly received relatively high wages, caused Europeans, or in some versions of the argument, Britons, to focus their attention on labor-saving innovations, while other societies saw little or no need to economize on labor. The reliance of this argument on Hagenel's demographic argument and or Brenner's institutional one, both discussed above, should be fairly clear. The unique Western European need to cut down on the use of expensive labor, so the story goes, ultimately led to machinery, modern industry, and vastly improved per capita productivity and living standards, while other societies were more interested in looking for innovations that economized on land, capital, or some specific scarce material. Thus, Europeans were not necessarily more creative, but high-wage costs steered their efforts in the one direction that led to a real transformation. Versions of this argument have been put forward by scholars as diverse as J.B. Habakkuk, Britain versus Continental Europe, Mark Elvin, China versus Europe, David Washbrook, India versus Europe, and André Gunder-Frank, Asia generally versus Europe, 84, and it dovetails with the common claim that Europe was already richer than the rest of the world before industrialization. But the argument does not work, except perhaps in one or two specific industries. First, there are empirical problems. As we have seen in the first half of this chapter, it seems likely that average incomes in Japan, China, and parts of Southeast Asia were comparable to or higher than those in Western Europe, even in the late 18th century. If this is true, then the case that European manufacturers faced higher wage costs would have to rest on one of two possibilities. It is conceivable that the distribution of income could have been more equal in Western Europe, or at least Britain, if one accepts that the Industrial Revolution began there, so that workers were receiving a larger share of a comparable average per capita income than workers elsewhere. Alternatively, a society could have had a system of unfree labor, such that, even though workers received fairly high aggregate payment for working, they received no incremental payment for working harder and could not seek other work if their patrons have no productive work for them to do. In such a scenario, despite what appear to be high wages, it would make more sense for elites to try to squeeze more hours of labor out of their subordinates than to invest in labor saving technology. This latter scenario may well describe the situation in certain parts of Southeast Asia, where highly skilled artisans, though scarce enough that they were often well rewarded for their work, were bound to aristocratic patrons who protected them and monopolized their output. It may apply to some parts of India as well, but formally free or semi-free, if often poorly paid, artisans seem to have been more common there, at least until British rulers legislated against various techniques weavers had used to maintain autonomy vis-a-vis those who advanced them their working capital. 8, and such a model has little relevance for most Chinese artisans even in the 1400s, and virtually none once the system of government-designated hereditary artisans collapsed in the 1500s. As we shall see in the next chapter, Chinese labor may well have been freer than early modern European labor. It was certainly not much less so. The bound labor scenario might at first seem more relevant to Tokugawa Japan, in which various occupational statuses, restrictions on mobility, and hereditary patron-client relationships were supposedly fixed by edict, but, as we shall see in the next chapter, the reality was very different from the The argument about very cheap wage labor is knottier. In Chapter 3 we shall see some evidence that the distribution of income in Qing China and Tokugawa Japan was actually more equal than that in Western Europe, in general, and late 18th century Britain in particular. For India, on the other hand, the bulk of the anecdotal evidence presented in Chapter 3 suggests that income distribution was more unequal than it was in Europe. Quantitative evidence is scarce, with some pointing in each direction. However, even the East Asian evidence is far from conclusive and mostly suggests that the very top of society claimed no more of national income in China and Japan than Europe's elite did. China and Japan could nonetheless have had a larger layer of desperately poor people than Western Europe did, who pushed unskilled wages down to a level significantly below those in Europe. Although I see no particular reason to think that this was the case, and the anecdotal testimony of most Europeans visiting East Asia before 1840 suggests the opposite. 7. The possibility cannot be dismissed. Moreover, there is a distinct but related and more likely scenario that would reconcile high living standards in Chinese and Japanese cores with wage bills lower than those confronting at least Dutch and English employers. Despite the rural location of much Dutch and English industry in the mid-17th and 18th centuries, there is strong evidence that by this time, relatively few workers in those countries moved seasonally between farm and non-farm labor. Before this period, many industrial laborers had worked in agriculture at peak season, at least in the Netherlands, and earned relatively high wages for doing so. As the agricultural and industrial labor markets became more separated, day wages had to rise to enable what were now less fully employed workers to survive. Such a wage increase indeed occurred, but at the price of increased unemployment. By contrast, many Chinese and Japanese handicraft workers were almost certainly less fully detached from agriculture. Thus, at least in theory, they could earn less for their weaving, spinning, or tile-making and still enjoy a standard of living as high or higher than their Dutch and English counterparts. Such a scenario is plausible, though far from established, and, if correct, it would reconcile our other findings with a particularly strong incentive for at least some European employers to find ways to use less labor. It would also mean that English employers would have had less trouble keeping their factories going all year round than employers whose workers also farmed. Thus, they would have more incentive to invest in centralized plant and equipment. European employers also faced the problem of relatively high food prices, which meant that even if they did not have to pay higher real wages, they did pay higher cash wages than many, if not all, of their Asian competitors.
No.
But even if we grant provisionally the argument that Western European wages were higher than any Asian ones, there are problems with inferring that this stimulated the technological changes of the Industrial Revolution.
Indeed.
Under early modern conditions, high wages could as easily discourage technological innovation in general as it could encourage labor-saving inventions. Joel Mocher suggests this seemingly paradoxical conclusion based on a model that seems fairly close to 18th century realities.
Assume, he says, that
new technology must be embodied in new capital equipment, which must be paid for. Assume further that wages make up the bulk of most manufacturers' costs and that there are few ex-ante differences in technology large enough to give a firm or country with a higher wage bill lower total production costs for a particular product. Thus, those with higher wage bills will generally have lower profits than their competition. If, as was also generally true until well into the 19th century, bank financing for the purchase of new capital equipment is either non-existent or, to the slight extent that it exists, dependent on a firm's earnings, then any equipment embodying new technology will have to be financed out of retained earnings, and those with higher wages will be less able to do that. Thus, rather than stimulating labor-saving technical innovations, a high wage bill may just as plausibly discourage any sort of new technology. And though this model may seem counterintuitive today, it appears to work for earlier eras. It has been used, for instance, to help explain why the very sophisticated and very high-wage Dutch economy was remarkably late to adopt mechanized industry. Furthermore, though the industrialization of the last 200 years has generally been labor-saving and capital-demanding, it is anachronistic to assume that this was always the reason for the major innovations. The application of coal and steam power to all sorts of processes eventually led to enormous labor savings, but the 18th century innovations that made coal usable in making iron, glass, beer, and so on were aimed at saving money on fuel. Coal was cheaper than wood, not at saving labor, and the steam engines that pumped water out of coal mines did not substitute for men doing the same work so much as they simply made it possible to exploit certain mines that no number of men could otherwise have used. Other developments in glass, blowing, iron making, and so on were not particularly concerned with saving on any factor of production. They were concerned with making a higher quality product. If the makers of the Industrial Revolution were primarily economizing on expensive labor, they were unaware of it. In a study of 18th century English patentees, Christine MacLeod finds that most declared the goals of their innovation to be either improving the quality of the product or saving on capital, a goal that makes more sense when we remember that, unlike post-1870 technological change, the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution mostly came embodied in relatively cheap capital goods. Only 3.7% cited saving on labor as a goal. 2. And if inventors were not particularly intent on saving labor, those who judged their inventions were even less so. As late as the 1720s, it apparently counted against a patent apply can't if he said that his machine saved labor. 3. The long-run results of change were no doubt labor-saving, but for an argument that high wages focused efforts in a particular direction, conscious motivations would seem to be the heart of the matter. And finally, since most of the capital goods involved were relatively low cost ones themselves, even a producer who enjoyed a fairly low wage scale would have had an incentive to try them. Indeed, it has been hard to show that low wage costs inhibit the adoption of labor-saving technology, even in our own age of much more expensive capital goods. 94. Such arguments have sometimes held up where the differences in labor costs are vast, e.g., contemporary Pakistan and Germany, but not where the wage differentials were real but not huge, e.g., Victorian Britain versus the United States. And immense wage differentials are hard to find before the mid-19th century, since differences in national wealth were not nearly what they are today. If pre-19th century entrepreneurs were profit-maximizing, then the only innovations they should have passed up because of cheap labor were ones that provided only marginal labor savings anyway. To pass up something like cotton spinning on these grounds alone, a manufacturer would have had to enjoy virtually costless labor. In Chapter 2, we will see various examples of Chinese farmers spending money in order to save themselves labor, even though Mark Elvin and other proponents of the wage incentive argument would claim that Chinese manufacturers ignored labor-saving devices because Chinese labor, unlike European labor, was so cheap. But the high wages hypothesis might still be relevant for one crucial sector, cotton textiles, for which both Braudel and Frank assert its importance. Here, there was very little ambiguity about what innovations in spinning did. They cut, perhaps by over 90%, the amount of labor needed to spin a given amount of yarn. And while such enormous savings should have been tied to employers paying virtually any wage rates, they may well have been particularly attractive to English makers of cotton textiles, who faced much higher nominal wage bills than the Indian producers with whom they compete for various price-sensitive markets in West Africa, the Middle East, and especially the New World, where slaves wore the cheapest cottons. The textiles that China exported in this period, and increasingly, even the ones that Jiangnan, China's leading textile region, sold in other parts of China, were fairly high quality and did not compete primarily on price. But British cotton manufacturers could not possibly compete against Indian cottons in the Middle East, Africa, and the New World, unless they cut their wage bills. Of course, British textile producers could easily have failed to do so and lost this battle with Indian producers. Necessity does not always yield invention. And for Britain as a whole, the issue of whether its textiles makers would conquer these markets need not have seemed crucial ex ante, since the East India Company marketed their rivals' goods, even though these textile markets were quite strategic. Any necessity operating here was a necessity for the textile producers themselves, not for England. The most strategic of these markets was West Africa, since a ready supply of desired textiles was essential for buying slaves there. But at least some of the cloth needed there was expensive, high-quality material, and British slave traders were less concerned with the price of this cloth than with getting enough of it first from India and only later from the mother country. 99. So even here, the high-wage/necessity argument faces problems. Nonetheless, in this restricted but important case, it may well have some merit. It at least suggests how the patterns of world textile trade and the ways in which English manufacturers competed against Bengal in particular, which was both a low-wage economy, or at least a low-cash-wage economy, to start with, and one in which the East India Company used increasing amounts of violence to enforce below-market prices for textiles after 1757-1100 may have intensified the search for mechanized spinning and weaving. Furthermore, it does illustrate, among other things, how important it is to look for explanations of particular innovations, rather than of industrialization in general, to root those explanations in the specifics of the relevant industries and in what people at the time thought certain innovations could accomplish, while also trying to choose examples that were critical to the broader phenomenon of emerging European supremacy. Armed with knowledge of how the Industrial Revolution did happen, one is tempted to look for European advantages connected to its two most important and dynamic sectors, textiles and the coal/steam/iron complex, especially the latter. And one does find some relevant European advantages, but often in surprising places. In textiles, the Chinese had long had machines that differed in just one crucial detail from both Hargreaves's spinning jenny and Kay's flying shut.
Claire. 10.
Thus, one could hardly say that Western Europe had any significant lead in technology for this sector until those inventions were actually made.
Nor
can one conclude that just because the last piece needed in both cases seems simple in retrospect, its absence shows that technological innovation in China stopped altogether. Much of 18th century European technology was most developed 150 years earlier, but the intervening wait does not indicate technological stagnation. 102. We must remember that what now seems obvious was often anything but obvious beforehand. Moreover, English textile innovations could easily also have become footnotes to history rather than major milestones. At the time that the British pioneered major improvements in cotton spinning, cotton was a minor fabric. In Europe, the mechanization of flax spinning and wool spinning took significantly longer. And as we shall see in Chapter 5, there were serious ecological and social obstacles to the further expansion of either wool or flax product. Tie-in in Europe. Cotton came from abroad and was available only in fairly limited quantities throughout most of the 18th century. Indeed, the increased demand for raw cotton that the new spinning technology created produced very sharp price rises, which would have greatly limited the usefulness of this technology without the rise of cotton growing in the American South. 103. This problem can be phrased in a more general way. Histories of technology often imagine one breakthrough creating a bottleneck that concentrates efforts on a specific problem, and so leads to another breakthrough, as when advances in weaving created incentives to speed up spinning. But such bottlenecks are just as often addressed by allocating more resources, without any change in techniques, and the longer that process of reallocation of resources continues, the less incentive remains to find a technological solution. A good example is the massive increase in the number of coal miners in the late 19th century, as the uses of fossil fuels for all sorts of processes soared without much change in the productivity of mining itself. 10. In the case of mechanized textile production, a bottleneck was created in the growing of cotton and other fibers, which required the application of more land and more labor. As we shall see in chapters 5 and 6, it is unlikely that the necessary land to relieve this bottleneck could have been found in Europe. Though sheep raising did expand in Poland and Russia, 105 it was nowhere near enough, and cotton production remained minimal. Meanwhile, the labor that was applied to this bottleneck was largely that of African slaves. To the extent that European labor was applied to this bottleneck, it was labor used in sailing, trading, coercing, and manufacturing of goods swapped for slaves in Africa and for the cotton itself. As Chapter 6 will show, that particular way of reallocating labor to solve this bottleneck was far more advantageous to Europe in the long run than it would have been to increase the agricultural labor force in order to grow more fiber at home, even if the land to do that had been available.
China
and Japan both went this route, squeezing more food and fuel out of some land in labor-intensive ways, while converting some lands from both forest and food crops to fiber growing. But they did so at considerable long-run cost. And while the case of cotton is unusually clear-cut, various other growing industries and the rising population's demand for food also created bottlenecks that were ultimately solved without using more European land or putting more labor onto that land. While Parthasarathi sees industrialization as in part Britain's way of escaping a vicious cycle of low per acre yields, costly food, high cash wages, competitive difficulties, it is well to remember that industrialization alone could not solve the problem that allegedly induced the technological gains in industry unless it could also meet the agricultural needs of industries and workers. And since, as we will see, British yields per acre did not rise much between 1750 and 1850, that solution had to involve trading partners who could bring large amounts of additional land into play. But still more basically, it is quite possible to imagine a huge productivity increase in cotton spinning and weaving that did not lead to a fundamental break with the ecological constraints of the 18th century. The fiber needed for textiles still needed land, and competition for land among thus for necessities food, fuel, fiber, and building materials was growing ever more intense in much of 18th century Europe. As long as food and fuel prices rose faster than wages, L07 as they did in most of 18th century Europe, it is hard to see how demand for textiles could grow definitely even with weaving and spinning costs falling, and the new textile technology had no clear application to other sectors. These developments in cotton textile production could easily have led to just an intensification of processes, to be discussed further in Chapter 2, that the long-standing growth of rural handicraft industries already represented processes that included accelerating population growth, increased pressure on the land, greater labor intensity, stagnant real wages, and probably an eventual ecological dead end, rather than a breakthrough. 18th century Western Europe faced serious ecological pressures, which will be discussed much more thoroughly in Chapter 5. Briefly, the demographic and economic expansions of the long 16th and 18th centuries, especially the second half of the latter, led to massive deforestation in Western Europe, with levels of forest cover and per capita wood supplies falling below even those in densely populated China, not to mention India. And deforestation brought other problems in its wake.
Archeologia Levi
Denke from France and Germany suggests that the 18th century was one of the two worst in history for soil erosion. Documentary evidence confirms this and adds several other deforested areas which experienced massive dust storms, declining yields, and other signs of serious ecological stress. 108 studies of erosion in modern times suggest that it tends to be the most visible sign of a much broader set of soil problems. 109 The late 18th century also witnessed an unusual weather pattern known as the European monsoon, a pattern in which unusually long droughts alternated with brief, unusually violent
rains.
When such rainfall came, it was both unusually erosive and of little use. to crops, especially since Europeans, unlike, say, Indians, did not have sieve irrigation systems to store and channel it. It is not clear what caused this climatic episode, but it appears more often in badly deforested areas. 110 since trees moderate the seasonality of local rainfall patterns. One of the few temperate zone areas that has such a monsoon climate today is badly deforested North China. North China is also much further south, and thus closer to tropical pressure systems, than is Northern Europe. These ecological pressures did not add up to a Malthusian crisis, in which European living standards were about to collapse. On the contrary, they were brought about in some areas by rising levels of per capita consumption as well as population growth. But they did, as we shall see, pose substantial impediments to further growth. Yet in the 19th century, while European population and per capita consumption accelerated, ecological variables stabilized. Western Europe's forest cover stabilized sometime between 1800 and 1850, after 400 years of decline, and even increased throughout the 19th century in Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium. 112 erosion decreased, and soil fertility stabilized or even improved, and the European monsoon disappeared, and a more typical rainfall pattern returned. 113. Clearly, then, a big part of the European achievement in the Industrial Revolution was to escape a long-standing pattern in which all growth placed significant incremental demands on the land. And with a few exceptions such as Denmark, this achievement did not rely on using large amounts of additional labor to make an acre yield more while protecting its fertility, in the manner famously described by Esther Boserup. In the late 19th century, labor inputs per acre even fell substantially. Yet the breakthroughs in chemistry that today allow capital to substitute for land and labor, to an astonishing degree, above all through using synthetic fertilizer and through making synthetic materials that are not grown at all, belong to the very late 19th and 20th centuries. How, then, did sustained European growth become ecologically sustainable? To understand how self-sustaining growth became possible, one must look, as E.A. Wrigley has argued, for developments that ease the pressures on the
land.
Wrigley emphasizes increased use of coal, which yielded far more power per unit of surface than would ever could. For to this, I would add the adoption of New World food crops, particularly the potato, which yielded what for Europe were unprecedented amounts of calories per acre, improvements in ecological understanding and land, especially forest management, which, as Richard Grove has shown, owed much to colonial experiences and the enormous resources gained by applying existing techniques to vast new territories overseas. The last of these developments was not principally technological and will be the focus of Chapter 6. For now, suffice it to say that the New World yielded both land-intensive products, cotton, sugar, and later grain, timber, meat, and wool, and land-restoring products such as guano. The potato, ecological learning, and coal are part of this chapter's technology story, as is the general setting that made them so important. The potato produced far more calories per acre than existing European
crops.
The potato was also adopted in 18th century China and Japan, but almost exclusively as a crop for the highlands, since rice already produced enormous amounts of food per lowland acre. In Europe, where grain yields were much lower, both per acre and relative to seed, the potato also conquered the lowlands in such densely populated areas as Ireland and Belgium. Replac. ING 40% of cereal calories in Flanders by 1791. 5, and, somewhat later, in much of Central and Eastern Europe. A less widely known factor was, like the potato, a technological advance. In the 19th century, Europeans began to apply principles of scientific conservation to their forests and to understand the importance for the ecosystem as a whole of protecting trees. The path to this particular breakthrough has been carefully traced by Richard Grove. Interestingly, although this advance owed much to the application of European science, Newtonian mechanics played an important role in understanding how trees recycled water and affected local climate. Some ideas popular in Europe were hindrances. Even in the early 19th century, many European doctors and botanists blamed forests for disease-bearing, miasmas, and recommended clear-cutting woods as a public health measure. 116. The solidification of European ecological understanding just in time, it would appear, to help stabilize northwestern Europe, L7 before it suffered the fate of parts of the Mediterranean or even northern China was related to empire in two crucial ways. First of all, it was on tropical islands that Europeans were able to observe the relationships among changing land use, climate, especially desiccation, and changes in soil quality unfolding at a speed that resolved debates that they could not resolve theoretically, and it was in newly colonized parts of India, where European demand and changes in property rights produced rapid shifts in land use, that they began to see that the same dynamics could affect a continental land mass too. Moreover, the colonial botanists, surgeons, and officials, often the same people who worked out these relationships, learned an enormous amount about how to manage ecosystems from South Chinese and especially South Indian practices, which were in many ways more advanced than their own. Japanese practices may have been still better, but they were much less accessible to curious foreigners. 118. Finally, the much weaker property rights in the colonies and the relative independence of colonial regimes from local property owners allowed British, French, and Dutch colonial officials to actually experiment with environmental regulation schemes, some of them quite radical, in a way they could not have done back home. This knowledge from overseas, once brought to Europe and the United States in the 19th century, became the basis for forestry services, for how-to books on using trees to help maintain or improve arable land, and
so on.
119. Thus, empire helped Europe erase its technological disadvantage in agroforestry, through the potato, through ecology, and through numerous important influences on botany. 120, providing crucial imports of knowledge along with the imports of resources that we will discuss later. There was, however, no extra-European dimension in the last of our great land-saving technological shifts, the increasing use of coal, especially in Britain, both to replace fuel wood and as the basis for whole new processes. Coal was central to earlier views of the Industrial Revolution. Only cotton, iron, steel, and railways got comparable attention, and except for cotton, these other main sectors depended on coal. But more recently, coal has often been de-emphasized. People have noted, for instance, that more early factories were powered by water than by coal, and that most of England's coal was used for the unglamorous and not particularly innovative tasks of home heating and
cooking.
E.A. Wrigley has reasserted the centrality of coal by calculating that it would have taken 15 million acres of woodland, 21 million had he used a less conservative conversion, to match England's annual energy yield from coal by 1815, 12 foot, but it is not obvious what this figure tells us. In the absence of the coal boom, England would not have consumed that much additional wood. Nor does Wrigley say it would have, since it did not have it. Nor can we say for sure that some specific number of forges would have closed, glass gone unmade, or homes unheated. The adjustments would have involved some complex combination of people being colder, buying more clothes, producing less iron, and so on, and we cannot be sure that particular industrial advances, much less industrialization more generally, would have ground to a halt with our coals. Nonetheless, at least a partial return to the earlier emphasis on coal seems warranted, both for Wrigley's reasons and for others. Water may, for a time, have powered more mills than coal, but it was geographically restricted, non-portable, and often seasonally unreliable. Moreover, it was no substitute for combustion in all sorts of chemical and physical processes, from brewing to metallurgy to dye-making, nor in the transport revolution that gave such a boost to the division of labor. In the critical iron sector, and thus also steel, railways, and so on, it is hard to see what alternative to fossil fuels could have been found. True, Hammersley has shown that, contrary to some earlier claims, England's iron industry in the 1660 to 1760 period did not contract and probably was not critically short of affordable fuel. He estimates that forest, covering 2% of the land of England and Wales, would have sufficed to supply England's iron industry in this period. 2. But by the end of the 18th century, only 5 to 10% of Britain was forest. 123. Thus, even under ideal conditions, the maximum possible output of charcoal pig iron in Britain would have been roughly 87,500 to 175,000 tons, but by 1820, actual British iron output reached 400,000 tons. 124, and aside from needing some wood for other purposes, it was not feasible to mobilize all wood for charcoal iron making. Forges also needed to be close to both iron and water power to drive the bellows, and charcoal for iron production could not be transported more than 10 to 12 miles, preferably under 5. The furnaces needed large chunks of charcoal, but it tended to break into small bits or even dust when moved very far. 25. So while Hammersley does show that iron production at 1760 levels did not face an energy crisis, and a fortiori that deforestation did not cause the breakthrough to coal-based iron, the same figures show that the iron industry's further growth did require coal. In most other British industries, development of coal-based processes came earlier than it did in iron, making 126, and thus substantially predates the Mau's steam engine-powered expansion of coal output. Thus the coal/steam engine boom could not have caused those innovations, but that does not make it irrelevant to the growth of those industries. Even if coal was mostly used for home heating, fuel for industry would have been far more expensive had less coal been available. Granted, real English charcoal prices seem to have stabilized in the 1700 to 1750 period after rising sharply for 1550 to 1700, though all wood and charcoal prices must be treated with considerable caution. 127. And even before steam engines allowed deeper mining, cheap coal was gradually becoming more widely available thanks to road and canal building, but as we shall see shortly, those gradual improvements were quite small compared to those made possible by steam, especially after 1750, and would soon have reached their limits. Moreover, real charcoal prices rose again after 1750, probably due to increased iron output, even with more coal coming online. 28. Vastly more expensive fuel would certainly have put a crimp in the quantitative expansion of many industries, and it is not hard to see it limiting Innova tie-in as well. As we shall see, even the steam engine itself was at first sufficiently bulky, fuel-hungry, and dangerous that experimenting with it might not have seemed worth it if its fuel had cost much more and if the coal mines themselves had not been an ideal place to use it. We will have more to say about deforestation and continental Europe in Chapter 5. For now it suffices to see how essential coal was to Britain's breakthroughs, especially in iron, steel, steam, power, and transport. Moreover, though it would be too teleological to see in the early 19th century coal boom all the ways in which cheap fossil fuels have eventually relaxed pressures from a finite land supply, even in farming itself, thanks to energy-intensive fertilizers, it was clearly a crucial step. Water power, no matter how much the wheels were improved, simply did not have the same potential to provide energy inputs that would significantly outpace a rapidly growing population for decades to come, or to permit chemistry to substitute for
Land.
Thus it seems sensible, after all, to look at the mining and uses of coal as the most likely European technological advantage that was purely home-grown, crucial to its 19th century breakthrough, and, unlike textiles, not dependent for its full flowering on European access to overseas resources. Steam engines were crucial here, both as machines that used coal to power other processes and as the power source for more effective water pumps which permitted a huge expansion of coal mining itself. M. W. Flynn has noted that despite the many ways in which wind, water, gravity, and horses were used to drain mines. None of these would have been much use at the depths where most of the country's reserves were. Thus, without steam, mining in Britain could scarcely have expanded beyond 1,700 levels of annual output and must probably have begun to show diminishing returns. 129 instead, output grew by roughly 70% over the next 50 years and by almost 500% more between 1750 and 1830, making the total increase roughly 900%, as steam engines for mining became both more numerous and more effective. 130. Steam engines of a sort had been developed in various societies before the 18th century, though without ever becoming much more than a curiosity. 131. The Chinese had long understood the basic scientific principle involved the existence of atmospheric pressure and had long since mastered, as part of their box bellows, a double-acting piston/cylinder system, much like Watt's, as well as a system for transforming rotary motion to linear motion that was as good as any known anywhere before the 20th century. All that remained was to use the piston to turn the wheel rather than vice versa. In a bellows, the jet of hot air moved by the piston was the goal, not a step toward powering the wheel. A Jesuit missionary who showed off working miniature models of both a steam turbine-driven carriage and a steamboat at court in 1671 appears to have been working as much from Chinese as from Western models. 132. In a strictly technological sense, then, this central technology of the Industrial Revolution could have been developed outside of Europe. 2. Thus we can never say definitively why it was in fact developed first in Europe. We can, however, identify some reasons why Europe, more specifically Britain, was a particularly likely site for the series of linked developments in coal and steam central to the Industrial Revolution.
And when we
compare England to the Yangtze Delta where similar incentives existed to relieve pressure on the local wood supply, and where advanced technology and a highly commercialized economy were also present, Europe's advantage rested as much on geographic accident as on overall levels of technical skill, and much more than on any probably non-existent advantage in the market efficiency of the economy as a whole, the relevant skills in which Western Europe led the 18th century world were ones in which Britain led. One of these was mining itself, but the others are not ones whose relevance is immediately obvious. Clockmaking, gun-making, and navigational instruments. The story of Chinese mining in general and coal mining in particular is somewhat puzzling. North and northwest China have huge coal deposits, and in the long era, when the North included China's political, economic, and demographic center of gravity, China developed a huge coal and iron complex. Indeed, Hartwell estimates that Chinese iron production around the year 1080 probably exceeded that of non-Russian Europe in 1700. Moreover, this iron and coal complex was not merely large but sophisticated. Chinese iron makers, for instance, seem to have known things about the creation and use of coke, purified coal, that would not be discovered elsewhere for centuries. 133. But in the years from 1100 to 1400, North and Northwest China were hit by a staggering series of catastrophes, invasions and occupation by the Mongols and others, civil wars, enormous floods including a major shift in the Yellow River, and plague. The Jurchen invaders of the 12th century often demanded that some of the most skilled artisans in the capital region be turned over to them as a price for temporarily halting their siege. It is unclear how many ever returned. 134. By the time the area began to enjoy some stability again after 1420, China's demographic and economic center had shifted irrevocably to the ecologically more hospitable south. Much of North China needed to be repopulated by government-led transfers of people during the 15th century. 135. We now know that contrary to what was once thought, iron mining and iron working did recover from the Mongol invasion. New centers of production Taiwan arose in Guangdong, Fujian, Yunnan, and Hunan, and there was some recovery of production in the northwest as well. Total output reached a new high of at least 45,000 tons by 1600, and there were some new developments in production techniques. 136. Huang Kitchen Study, which has shown us this post-Mongol revival of iron production, says very little about fuel, but it is striking that all the new centers of production, which he estimates had over 70% of iron production, were far from coal sources, leading one to suspect that this iron was largely made with wood and charcoal fuel. 137. We still know very little about what happened to iron production in the 17th and 18th centuries, though this same study suggests, based on very slight evidence, that it declined. 138. If it did, or even if it just failed to keep growing, a shift away from reliance on fossil fuel as a result of the post-Mongol relocation might well have been quite fateful. As for coal production and use more generally, there is still much we do not
know.
Hartwell's claim that the industry never recovered from the Mongol invasions and related catastrophes may someday be seriously challenged, as his parallel claim about iron has been. But as yet this has not happened. And even if it turns out that coal did not decline as dramatically as he thinks, it certainly was never again a cutting-edge sector of the Chinese economy. It is unclear how much knowledge about the extraction and use of coal was wiped out amid the catastrophes of the 12th through 14th centuries, a distinct possibility, since both in China and Europe as late as the 19th century, it was often passed orally from master to apprentice rather than writ 10 down, and how much ceased to be used or developed further as the area housing most of China's coal became a backwater, far from major markets and far from invigorating interaction with other sorts of craftsmen. Although coal mining remained significant in China, it was never again a cutting-edge sector. Instead, various fuel-saving innovations, including stir-frying in a wok instead of boiling food in heavier vessels, became increasingly important. The 18th century Lower Yangtze region, China's richest region and one of its most deforested, stretched its supplies by trading along riverine and coastal routes for wood and bean cake fertilizer. The fertilizer allowed people to burn grasses and crop residues for fuel that would otherwise have had to be returned to the soil. Though such trade-based palliatives did not rule out simultaneous experimentation with fossil fuels, the two coexisted elsewhere, and could easily have done so in the Lower Yangtze without leaving many traces in the documents. It was hardly likely that coal in particular would have attracted much attention from the Lower Yangtze's artisans and entrepreneurs. There was little coal either in the region itself or in places easily accessible to its traders. China's 9 southern provinces have just 1.8% of contemporary China's coal reserves, and its 11 eastern provinces 8%. By contrast, the northwestern province of Shaanxi plus Inner Mongolia have 61.4%. 139. Some coal mines did operate in various parts of South China and within marketing range of Beijing. In the North 40, they were mostly small and poorly positioned to take advantage of China's richest and most fuel-hungry market. They were also hampered, at least intermittently, by inconsistent government policies. For by far the largest deposits, which theoretically might have justified major investments in production and transportation improvements, were those in the Northwest. Although the returns to linking those northwestern coal deposits with the Yangtze Delta seem so huge in retrospect that it is tempting to imagine some people making an enormous effort to do so. It is not clear what that could have been, and most of the returns to such a project that we can now imagine, given what we know about the uses of coal, were invisible ex ante. Meanwhile, northwestern coal miners, operating in a generally backward region, were not particularly likely to learn of technical developments elsewhere that they might have been able to apply to their problems, and had little chance of encountering artisans who had learned precise workmanship in stylized luxury crafts such as clockmaking. Such artisans did exist, and their skills, if not their numbers, seem to have been not far behind their Western counterparts, but they were almost all in the Yangtze Delta or along the south east coast, where there was a veritable craze for clocks and mechanical toys, with elaborate jackwork. 142, and even if mine operators had seen how to improve their mining techniques, they had no reason to think that extracting more coal would allow them to capture a vastly expanded market, seemingly insuperable transport problems would still have separated their mines from the rich but ecologically needy fuel users of China's major cities. 143 The mines in Suzhou and Suxian in northern Jiangsu, not too far from the Grand Canal, might have been the best positioned among the few mines entirely within reach of the Yangtze Delta, but even in the Suzhou mines, the cost of coal in Qing times doubled by the time it reached the county seat, which was also the canal port. 144 Like their counterparts further north, these mines had been part of a heavy industrial complex, particularly focused on iron and salt production in Song times, and seem never to have fully recovered from a series of disasters in the 12th through 14th centuries. In the 18th century, when the government decided to encourage coal in this area with the explicit goal of alleviating the Yangtze Delta's fuel shortage, it also chose to give the mining licenses to poor and unemployed people who mostly dug small, shallow mines. 45. Although it seems unlikely that even better capitalized mines would have achieved the major breakthroughs needed to transform China's energy, transport, and metal sectors, having such small operators in charge at one of the few sites in China where coal was within relatively easy reach of both large markets and concentrations of skilled artisans could hardly have improved the odds. Finally, the biggest technical problem faced by Chinese coal miners, especially in the Northwest, was fundamentally different from that faced by their counterparts in England. English mines tended to fill with water, so a strong pump was needed to remove that water. Chinese coal mines had much less of a water problem. Instead, they were so arid that spontaneous combustion was a constant threat. It was this problem, one that required ventilation rather than powerful pumps, that preoccupied the compiler of the most important Chinese technical manual of the period, and although the problem was never fully solved, at least one contemporary historian of mining has pronounced the approaches described in that manual quite sophisticated for their time. 146 Even if still better ventilation had ameliorated this problem, or if people wanted coal badly enough to pay for this high level of danger, ventilation techniques would not have also helped solve the problem of transporting coal and things in general, as the steam engines that pumped out Britain's mines did. Thus, while overall skill, resource, and economic conditions in China, taken as an abstract whole, may not have been much less conducive to a coal/steam revolution than those in Europe as a whole, the distribution of those endowments made the chances of such a revolution much dimmer. In contrast, some of Europe's largest coal deposits were located in a much more promising area, in Britain. This placed them near excellent water transport, Europe's most commercially dynamic economy, lots of skilled craftspeople in other areas, and, to give the problems of getting and using coal some additional urgency, a society that had faced a major shortage of firewood by 1600, if not before. 47 And although timber and timber-based products were imported by sea, this was far more expensive than receiving logs floated down a river as the Yangtze Delta did. The incentives to use and learn more about comparatively accessible coal were correspondingly greater. Indeed, from 1500 on, most demand for coal in England was for home heating. People used it because it was cheap, though its smoke and fumes were serious drawbacks. 148 Industries, from brewing to glassmaking to iron-making, could not tolerate the impurities this smoke introduced until a series of 18th-century innovations solved the problem. 149 Much of the knowledge about how to extract and use coal had been accumulated by craftsmen and was not written down even in the 19th century. Indeed, John Harris has pointed out that there was far less written about how to mine and use coal for industry in English than in French during the 18th century precisely because the people in England who needed to know the fine points, artisans, passed this knowledge along orally. Harris shows that French attempts to copy various coal-using processes foundered even when they reproduced the equipment because the production of, say, a heat-resistant crucible required very detailed knowledge and split-second timing, acquired through experience, and the financial losses from making a mistake could be very large. The crucial details of how long to hold things in the fire, at what angle, and how it should look at various points were so ingrained in men used to working with coal furnaces, but so completely different from what people used to wood furnaces experienced that an artisan from one tradition would not even know what needed explaining to one from the other. 150 only. When whole teams of English workers were brought over, mostly after 1830, was the necessary knowledge effectively transferred. Thus we see that technological expertise was essential to Europe's coal breakthrough, but the development of that expertise depended on long experience and many failures along the way, with abundant, cheap supplies. This experience was possible because artisan skill, consumer demand, and coal itself were all concentrated near each other. Without such geographic good luck, one could easily develop lots of expertise in an area with a limited future, e.g., in using and improving wood furnaces, and not proceed along the track that eventually led to tapping vast new supplies of energy. And the Chinese situation, in which coal deposits were far further removed from the Yangtze Delta than they were from, say, the Paris Basin, throws England's good fortune into still sharper relief. The steam engine represented an even more important breakthrough than the slow and steady progress in tunneling for coal or learning how to keep its smoke from spoiling beer, glass, and iron. We have already seen that in this sense, Britain was fortunate to have the mining problem it did and need to pump out water rather than prevent explosions, since it led to engines with many other crucial applications. But the steam engine did not invent itself, and here, too, location mattered to technological progress. What made the steam engine effective were, again, incremental improvements from numerous craftsmen, including some in rather unexpected lines of work. As Moker puts it, Europe's real technological edge in the 18th century, and Britain's within Europe, was not in tools or machines, but in instruments, clocks, watches, telescopes, eyeglasses, etc. Though these gadgets had some application as producer goods, principally in ocean-going navigations, their principal uses were as amenities for the well-to-do, especially the urban well-to-do. 152, yet it was the transfer of precision boring and calibrating skills from instrument making, and to some extent from gun making, that made Newcomen's original steam engine work reasonably well and then allowed for Watt's improvements, which quadrupled the engine's efficiency. 153. Living after 200-plus years of gradual improvements that have made engines much safer, much more fuel-efficient, 54, and much less bulky than either of these prototypes, we tend to assume that the potential of even the crudest steam engine would be so obvious that people would adopt it rapidly. But this is true only in retrospect. Even with the advantages conferred by spillovers from precision tool-making for weapons and instruments, the cost, bulk, and other problems of these machines meant that there were only 2,500 built. During the 88 years, 1712 to 1800, following Newcomen's first installation, 15 other industries and inventors mostly placed their bets on improved water wheels. Indeed, von Tunzelmann suggests that the costs of energy per unit of power for steam-run textile machinery did not decline precipitously until after 1830, so that water, where available, remained competitive until then. 156. Only in the coal fields, where there were 1,000 in use in 1800, were steam engine's advantages so obvious that they spread rapidly and transformed an entire industry within a few decades. 157. At a mine, the bulk of the steam engine did not matter, and the cost of its prodigious fuel intake, which rose rapidly with distance from the mine, was no problem either. In fact, pithead steam Engines often used inferior small coals so cheap that it probably would not have paid to ship them to users elsewhere, making their fuel essentially free. 158. Take away some of the incremental advantage conferred by skill transfers from nearby artisans in other fields, the learning by doing made possible by the application to nearby coal fields and the low cost of coal itself. And as incredible as it seems to us today, the steam engine could have seemed not worth promoting. The bridging of the social distance between artisans, entrepreneurs, and the sources of scientific knowledge was a triumph of Jacob's scientific culture, in which Europe may have had a significant edge, though we need more research to be sure. But even so, if it had been Europe that faced a huge geographic distance between its coal and its concentrations of mechanically skilled people, and China that had only a small distance to bridge, it is possible that the results in either place might have been vastly different. Certainly, the history of China's earlier coal/iron complex suggests as much. A surge in European technological inventiveness was certainly, in fact, tautologically, a necessary condition of the Industrial Revolution, but before we elevate that creativity to a place far above that of other 18th-century societies and reify it as the cause of Europe's subsequent primacy, we should bear in mind how crucial accidents of geography and juxtaposition were in making British coal and steam engines the cutting edge of industrialization.
If,
in retrospect, Europe backed the right horse, the factors that led to that particular winning bet seem critically connected to fortuitous and specifically English conditions, mostly geographic ones. European science, technology, and philosophical inclinations alone do not seem an adequate explanation, and alleged differences in economic institutions and factor prices seem largely irrelevant. Finally, as we shall see in later chapters, even this energy breakthrough could have been swallowed up by Europe's population boom in the late 18th and 19th centuries if certain other resource problems had not also been solved, in large part thanks to Europe's conquests in the rest of the world. Without both coal and colonies, neither one would have been nearly as significant, and without the relaxation of resource constraints they allowed, other European innovations alone would not have created a new world where having finite land did not prevent indefinitely sustained per capita growth.